Let's begin.
Good evening. I'm Linda Scherzer, Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, the Government Affairs, Public Policy, and Israel Advocacy Wing of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West. I am pleased to moderate tonight's conversation with Rutgers faculty member Rebecca Stipes. Tonight marks the second time in just under 4 weeks that we've brought the community together to unpack what has been a dramatic surge in anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity at our state university since October 7th. The last time we gathered was just after the announcement that a tent encampment at Rutgers had been dismantled peacefully, but only after Rutgers President Jonathan Holloway had apparently agreed to many of the demands of pro-Palestinian demonstrators. Tonight's webinar comes just 10 days after Holloway appeared before the House Education and Workforce Committee to answer questions about a pervasive climate of anti-Semitism at our state university. We'll share clips of that hearing tonight. We have spoken with Rutgers student leader Joe Gindy and Lisa Glass, executive director of Rutgers Hillel, about the many incidents of harassment and intimidation that Jewish students have endured this past year. We have heard about the ways that free speech has often turned into hate speech, and the frustration with university administrators for failing to address the Jewish community's concerns about bullying and intimidation. Tonight, we hear from a Jewish faculty member, the co-founder of JFAS, Jewish Faculty, Administration, and Staff, about her efforts to advocate for the Jewish community and ultimately her decision to step down as a Rutgers faculty member. Rebecca will share with us her perspective on what's been happening at Rutgers, how JFAS has tried to help the administration mitigate the disruptions that have permeated the campus, and what we as vested stakeholders must do to ensure that our students are kept safe and the university be held accountable. Rebecca and I will also discuss what Jewish values and our educational traditions can teach us in this moment about the importance of vigorous but respectful debate, critical thinking, pursuit of truth unto its innermost parts, and tolerance for differences of opinion, all of which, sadly and shockingly, has been in short supply at the very places which should be shrines to respectful civil discourse, our institutions of higher learning. While Rebecca will be leaving Rutgers and taking on a big new role at Yeshiva University this fall, it is clear she feels enormously invested in Rutgers' success and for the university to return to a place where all students feel equally protected, valued, and heard. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us tonight. So I would like to start. First of all, it's great to see you. We did not bump into each other today at the Israel Day Parade. No surprise there. I know both of us are wiped out. It was a wonderful day, and we've come to talk about some serious things this evening. Let's start, Rebecca, with you telling us a little bit about yourself, your academic discipline, and day to day, what you were doing at Rutgers prior to October 7th.
Sure. Thank you so much, Linda. And thanks to Federation and the JCRC for the opportunity to speak with you today. Yes, I feel deeply invested in the success of Rutgers University. It's really been an honor for me to be on the faculty here for a dozen years. I've worked very hard for this university, for our students, for our programs, because I feel so strongly that it's such a vital institution in our state. And so all of the critiques that I'm going to offer tonight are really with love and out of a desire to see the institution succeed. So to begin, I am an Orthodox Jew. I'm a mother of 3. I'm the wife of a former synagogue rabbi and a researcher. I'm an academic. Particularly, my field is music history and early music performance. So seemingly far from the issues we're going to discuss tonight, but in certain ways, very pertinent. I was hired as an assistant professor at Rutgers in 2012, tenured in 2017, and just promoted to full professor a year ago in 2023. I've also worked as an academic administrator in the Department of Music and in Mason Gross School of the Arts, where I've served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs for the past 3.5 years. Shortly after submitting my tenure dossier in 2016, I was having coffee with a good friend, Jenny Mandelbaum, who's now a professor emerita from the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers. And we were talking about, ways of starting to unify or establish networks among Jewish faculty and staff members. We knew our Jewish students were extraordinarily well served by institutions on and off campus, including Rutgers Hillel, Chabad, and others, and hats off always to the incredible professionals in those organizations. But we felt that the faculty and staff could also use such a network, both for their own kind of support and networking and well-being, but also because we saw the potential to have to stave off BDS initiatives and other potentially problematic initiatives that might hit the university. And so we founded a group called JFAS, which stands for Jewish Faculty, Administrators, and Staff. And from 2016 on, we were having sort of very small meetings with snacks and speakers and just asking people to share their research, very informal, and it was quite small. And there have been over the years a series of incidents or events that have needed, we felt, some intervention from Jewish faculty and staff. And so we have always tried to work collaboratively with the university administration, first with President Barchi, and then with President Holloway and his senior leadership, to kind of address things as they arose. The university's history with anti-Semitism goes back a very long time. There's evidence, at least from the early part of the 20th century, so almost a century at least, and probably longer than that. But we really wanted to be a resource to help the university navigate these matters, again, with a view to creating a welcoming environment for all Jewish employees and students at the university.
So thankfully, that organization was already in place, obviously, before October 7th. And you wrote a very compelling letter in the aftermath of the decisions made regarding that tent encampment, when that tent encampment came down, and the president and chancellor allegedly agreed to a number of demands that the pro-Palestinian students had made in order to disperse peacefully. And in it, you wrote that you have not been able to do really any scholarly publishing or writing this past year. So all the air has been sucked out of the room for you just because of what you've had to do to advocate for Jewish students and faculty. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what your life has looked like post October 7th?
Sure. And, I should clarify that I'm not looking for pity or anything, right? It was my decision to kind of devote myself to these issues. I could have done otherwise. But I'll also say, maybe start by saying that I may be an exception because of my leadership role within this group, JFAS. I think I somehow became a kind of focal point for a lot of what was going on. And so sort of faculty and staff who were experiencing trouble in the workplace or had seen students experiencing trouble came to me, right? And not because I have any special expertise, but really just because I was in this leadership position and they were, coming to look for advice. And so we would talk through the problems that they were witnessing or the problems that they were experiencing. But for example, I spoke to a student today who is enrolled in the School of Engineering, and she's primarily on the Bush campus. And she said that things there have been fairly quiet all year long. So Rutgers is a really big place. And I think that there are hotspots. And I think that it's perfectly possible for a student or a faculty or staff member to kind of go through the year and not really feel the brunt of what's been happening in other parts of campus as far as anti-Semitism.
I mean, we're talking about 6,000, correct? 6,000 Jewish students on campus. Right. I mean, at least the first or the second largest Jewish population in the country. And I think what you just said is a very important takeaway, that not every student has the same experience, and not every student is experiencing the worst of what we're seeing. But what would you say, I mean, have been some of the most egregious incidents? I mean, what have you heard about that has most disturbed you?
So I'll talk a little bit about, again, my kind of day-to-day dealings, and then some of the sort of incidents that have come up. Almost immediately after October 7th, JFAS started meeting and hearing from faculty and staff members about things that were happening in their departments or their units, some low-level problems, comments being made, or feeling socially isolated by their coworkers, sudden mistrust between them and others in their departments. And students were really saying the same, that there was this kind of ostracization or isolation, because there was an assumption that every Jew is a Zionist and every Zionist is bad and racist. And obviously these are vast oversimplifications, but that was not the interest of many people in the kind of social media generation, shall we say. So there were a lot of extreme emotions that these faculty and staff members were coming with to these JFAS meetings, people struggling really with grief, fear, and shock. And then there were also the practical issues of how to handle those incidents that were coming up. In addition, JFAS's numbers really expanded. We were trying to do organizing and letter writing. We did present the president and his leadership team with a series of recommendations in December for practical steps that they could take to mitigate some of the anti-Semitism that we were seeing. Obviously, this required a lot of logistical work, organizing, group editing, which is kind of, the academic's worst nightmare. But, really just very difficult and time-consuming problems. And so there were many days when I was coming to campus and thinking that I was going to get my job done, the actual job that I'm paid to do, and instead was sort of consumed instead by these other issues. So in terms of the most egregious incidents, I think some of these are already well known and we don't really need to talk about them. For example, the death threat against Israeli students at AEPI in the fall, the unauthorized use of a photo of a Jewish student on an anti-Israel poster in the spring. There's also the lawsuit. Yoel Ackerman is a law student at the law school at Rutgers Newark who is suing the university over alleged discrimination. But then there are all sorts of things that I think have not really come out and have not been adequately reported. There was one person whose role encompasses doing diversity trainings for her department and was specifically told not to organize a training on anti-Semitism so that the department would not appear to be taking sides. There was a staff member who told me that she was disciplined immediately after seeking help for a Jewish student. And the staff member feels pretty certain that the discipline was a result of her seeking help for that student, but she can't prove it. Just more insidious are those issues of general climate, the discourse around Israel, Zionism, and the war. And I would say also that for people who say, and there have been those very publicly recently who've said, oh, there is no anti-Semitism at Rutgers, that's because they're drawing a very sharp line between distinguishing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I do not draw such a sharp line. I think it's really complicated the way anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism interact and feed into one another. I think that calls for the destruction of the only Jewish state in the world and the justification of the murder of Jews simply because they live in Israel are anti-Semitic. And so for those of us who feel a connection to the state of Israel, which is something like 80 to 90% of American Jews, according to a Pew study in 2021, I think that was, many of us do feel that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and calls for the destruction of Israel are anti-Semitic. So there have also been kind of classroom complaints, classroom discussions that veer into the vilification of Israel for no obvious reason, posters hung all over buildings that include threatening slogans calling for the globalized intifada and so on. None of this is a punishable offense. None of it is actionable, but it obviously affects students very deeply and affects, frankly, faculty and staff members very deeply. There were incidents that were probably punished, right? The whole kind of conduct process is very opaque. But we think, for example, that one of the lectures that we organized through JFAS, which was disrupted, that disruption may have been one of the incidents that led to the temporary suspension of Students for Justice in Palestine back in December, but we're not sure, frankly. And then there's also the improper use of university resources like libraries, cultural centers, social media accounts, the student centers, other common spaces to promote, this anti-Israel narrative through posters, through protests. So when students walk into Alexander Library and see that a silent protest, even a silent protest is going on, and there are posters all over that area of the library, they know that that library space is not welcoming for them, and they leave.
Yeah.
And that's the library.
Yeah, no, these are spaces that are public, and much of what you're talking about is in full view. And I think that a lot of us have always felt that some of the more insidious examples and disturbing examples of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity and indoctrination and teaching in the classroom goes unseen and unheard, and I think is deeply troubling.
Linda, if I could just add one last point to that question. The university has the right to regulate protests, to regulate the time, place, and manner of protests. So I'm not a lawyer, but I would argue that the university actually has a responsibility to regulate time, place, and manner in a way that ensures that all students will still have access to those common resources like the libraries.
Yeah, so we are gonna get into a discussion about processes and when violations occur and what has been done. But as I mentioned earlier, Rutgers President Holloway did testify before a House committee 10 days ago with the presidents of Northwestern and UCLA. Let's listen to a portion of his opening statement in which the president himself frames for the committee what he describes as the vibrancy of Jewish life on his campus and how he has tried to address the disruptions caused by pro-Palestinian demonstrations. Let's roll that first clip.
So much to me. I tell you with pride that Rutgers boasts one of the largest Jewish student populations in America, and I tell you with conviction that we condemn anti-Semitism in the strongest terms possible. We do so today. We did so long before October 7th, and we will always do so. Rutgers, home to nearly 100,000 students, faculty, and staff, takes pride in being a public university. We conduct life-changing research and clinical care, and we educate tomorrow's leaders, many of them first-generation college students, and many of them from low-income families. What's more, Rutgers is world-renowned for its Jewish scholarly community. We are one of only a few dozen universities in America with a Department of Jewish Studies. Our Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life holds public lectures, trains teachers on Holocaust education, and hosts the Rutgers Jewish Film Festival. Rutgers is also home to the Miller Center on Policing and Community Resilience, which is dedicated to protecting valuable communities that are facing anti-Semitism or other forms of intolerance. The Rutgers Hillel and Chabad houses, both among the largest in higher education, sit in the heart of our Big Tent campus in New Brunswick. During my presidency, we have developed a formal partnership with Tel Aviv University focused on faculty collaborations. As part of that relationship, TAU researchers will have a presence in the Health and Life Sciences Center being built in New Brunswick. We find ourselves here today because of the devastation that the Hamas terrorist attacks have wrought. It is heartbreaking to think about the senseless and horrific violence of October 7th, about the hostages still held captive by Hamas 230 days later, about the thousands of Palestinian children killed in the war, about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza that gets worse every day. At Rutgers, this war has been a tragedy for our Jewish and Palestinian communities. Many in our community, searching for a way to curtail this tragedy, have turned to activism and protest. During this period of heightened fear, anxiety, and polarization, Rutgers has focused on three essential priorities: to ensure the safety of our community, to affirm and uphold our policies, and to promote dialogue and education.
So, Rebecca, the president just outlined, he outlined for the congressional committee the priorities of his administration in dealing with these protests, ensuring the safety of the community, affirming and upholding university policies, and promoting dialogue and education. What do how does that hit you? I mean, do you feel that the university has in fact upheld its own code of behavior? Do you think that students who have violated university policies have been held accountable? And what about the educational component? Do you see the university actually trying to bring students together to speak and to learn from each other? I mean, how is this overly positive or optimistic in the way that he's framed this? How does this hit you?
Right, thank you. Yeah, in terms of holding students who violate policies accountable, I think there's a gap in our knowledge. One of the recommendations that JFAS made back in December was that the university create a list, an open list of anonymized incidents, right? We understand the code of conduct needs to be kept confidential, and that's as it should be, but there could still be generalized or anonymized descriptions that are made public, incidents of anti-Semitism, and if appropriate, incidents of Islamophobia as well. So including what the complaint was, what the results of the investigation were, and if there was any disciplinary consequence. That has not yet happened, and I think that it would be very helpful. I think that daylight is a great disinfectant. So that's one point. I don't really know what to say in response to that. In terms of education, though, I think one problem that we have to kind of we have to think about is what are we talking about when we talk about the university? Is it the president and senior leadership, or is it rank and file faculty who are responsible ultimately for setting curriculum and for the day-to-day education of our students? So the senior leadership team, to their credit, did curate a series of lectures this past spring that tried to get people to talk to one another despite their disagreement, recognizing that they may enter with disagreements and they may not convince one another, so they would leave with disagreements, but at least to talk to one another. I think that that's admirable and commendable. Unfortunately, I think the lectures, that series did not really rise above the noise on campus. So it didn't have the kind of deep impact that we would hope, but it's a step in the right direction. But the problem when you're talking about rank and file faculty is that it does include a significant number of very vocal professors who see it as their job to advance the cause of the Palestinian people, even including advancing, this sort of anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, pro-terror, celebrating violence narrative, even when it means bending the evidence, presenting only one side of the story, and silencing opposition. And so, again, to have college professors who are, ignoring evidence to suit the narrative that they want to tell, and also glorifying violence and even encouraging, disruption and kind of chaos on campus, that's a real problem. The senior leadership of the university is not in a position to censor those people. But I do think that there's more that they can do to address that inflammatory rhetoric. But just one incident, I know we'll talk a little bit later about the Center for Security, Race and Rights, but just one incident I think is kind of illustrative of these problems. At one of the events hosted by that research center, which we'll get to, there was an Israeli professor who attended, listened respectfully to the lecture, which was wildly, biased and inflammatory against Israel. But this Israeli professor listened quietly, and during the Q&A session, stood up, introduced himself as a Jew, an Israeli, as a Zionist, and said, "I would like to engage in dialogue." And he was shouted down, and he was heckled, and afterwards he was targeted online. The live interaction happened with faculty looking on and kind of allowing and possibly even encouraging that kind of that silencing and that refusal to engage in any dialogue. For me, one of the scariest moments this year was hearing a chant at a protest by the Endowment Justice Collective, which includes both students and faculty and non-Rutgers people, whoever they are. This was in January at Brower Commons on campus, where the protesters, one of the leader of the chants was saying, even if you aren't Muslim, if you say these chants, this is a quote, "you are resisting on behalf of the Palestinians. Dying as a martyr, dying as a hero is one of the greatest sacrifices you can do as a Palestinian and as a Muslim." This is incredible. That's an end quote there. This is incredibly dangerous rhetoric. So there should have, I think, been a response from the administration. Certainly, they would speak out against the glorification of suicide. So why not speak out against the glorification of suicide that also takes the lives of Jews? To me, was a really shocking moment.
I mean, I think we have seen the hypocrisy of this moment demonstrated on many campuses, including Rutgers, because if any other minority or marginalized segment of the population was targeted in the ways that the Jewish population has been, this would have been stopped very quickly. And it sounds to me like, to your knowledge, there hasn't been any real consequences whatsoever, certainly for faculty.
I can't really say one way or another because it's just not been transparent.
Yeah. So I'd like to now turn to a second clip from the House committee hearing in which a certain Pennsylvania congressman, Lloyd Smucker, refers to the recommendations which you, Rebecca, gave to the Rutgers administration last December and pointedly asked the president if he will be acting on them. So let's play clip number 2.
And I'll commit to reviewing it.
Thank you. Earlier this month, you, as I said, gave in to the demands of the mob on your campus. You agreed to 8 of their 10 demands in a matter of days. However, you've refused to act on the requests of Rutgers Jewish faculty, administrators, and staff group called JFAS from this past December. They asked that you provide a full public accounting of anti-Semitic incidents on campus, suspend students and student organizations that repeatedly violate the code of conduct, prohibit academic departments from institutionally taking controversial political stances, and convene a standing university-wide committee on anti-Semitism in the Jewish experience. Why have you ignored JFAS, but acted immediately to appease pro-Hamas and anti-American protesters?
Thank you for the question. The first thing I'll say, I was not negotiating with the mob, but talking with students. To your question specifically, the Jewish Faculty Administration and Staff, JFAS organization, the requests they sent to us are being acted on post haste.
So will you commit today to fulfilling all the requests?
I will. In fact, part of the plan for the summer, we've already shared our drafted out our action plans, addresses most of those concerns, sir. Most of their concerns.
Will you commit to providing a full public accounting of anti-Semitic incidents on campus to them?
We are. We've been scrubbing our own information to make sure that we can get that information elevated.
So you'll commit to doing that?
We are doing that work, sir.
Will you commit to suspending students and student organizations that repeatedly violate the code of conduct?
When students violate the code of conduct, they go into a disciplinary process. The results could look like many different things.
Will you commit to suspending them if that happens?
If the review committee deems that it merits suspension, then yes, they would be suspended.
Will you commit to prohibiting?
So, Rebecca, I mean, that was quite a shout out from the congressional committee, which it should be noted has been getting information from many sources in our state, which has informed their understanding of what is going on campus. So he was asked very pointed questions about the ways that this is going to be remedied and rectified in the future. Are you hopeful? I mean, what is your response to the ways that the president answered these questions and the ways that he seems to now be attending and taking very seriously? Because, of course, this was testimony under oath that, in fact, things may get better, at least from the administration standpoint, for the new academic year.
I'm always hopeful. I think we have to be, right? Otherwise, how do you keep going? But I'll say that this segment of the hearing was the first time that I had heard that President Holloway say that he would be working to implement JFAS's recommendations. So that was a big moment. I was very, very pleased to hear it. And I'll also just mention in a separate segment of the hearing, I think it was in his introductory remarks, he specifically mentioned partnering with the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, on anti-Semitism training, and that had me positively cheering. That was one of our recommendations, but to hear him work that into his opening remarks told me that he had heard us, that he understood that there was a lot of concern coming out of the events in early May, the encampment and the way that it was dismantled, and that he was going back to the recommendations that we, and frankly, a lot of other stakeholders have been making. Again, Hillel, Chabad, your organization, right, or state organizations, really Jewish community groups around the state have been talking about the need for anti-Semitism training, courtesy of a group like the ADL. It's super important, and I'm really glad to know that he's taking the recommendation very seriously. And yes, I'm hopeful that that will help turn things around.
Yeah, no, I mean, you should feel very proud, I think, about the ways that you have helped move this administration along in a positive direction. And all of this is very difficult. I mean, I can't imagine it's easy being a university president these days. And I think your work behind the scenes has been important in supporting and advocating our students for sure. I want to mention to our audience that we are happy to entertain questions in the chat feature. We have about another 15 or 20 minutes of airtime, and we will gladly get to your questions. But I do want to air that final clip because it refers to the center that we were talking about earlier, Rebecca, one that I think many of the people watching tonight aren't aware of. This is not a center at Rutgers, New Brunswick. This is a center at Rutgers, Newark. It is led by a Rutgers law professor whose name is Sahar Aziz. This clip that we're about to show is a brief exchange between a member of the committee and President Holloway about the center. This center, as I said, is led by Sahar Aziz. It routinely hosts speakers who vilify the state of Israel, who often express views that are wildly anti-Semitic. One speaker, Colombia's Rashid Khalidi, in the late fall, actually expressed the view that he was awed and elevated by the attack on October 7th. Let's listen to the exchange in this final clip.
Any given moment.
As noted before, the director of CSRR, Sahar Aziz, has made numerous anti-Semitic statements, again with her $232,000 Rutgers-funded salary. She signed a statement condemning, quote, the racial supremacy of Jewish Zionist nationals, saying that Jews are more privileged than Muslims and delegitimizing both Israel and the U.S. as, quote, racist settler colonial states. Given that statement and her center's anti-Semitic pro-terrorist activities, do you think it's appropriate for Rutgers to continue to fund this office and pay her salary of $232,000? Is that okay? Is that cool with you and Rutgers?
There's very little that I find easy about the center, sir. I personally disagree deeply with a lot of the ideas that are come from that center.
Are you going to close the center, or you keep on funding it, keep paying that salary?
I have no plans to close the center, sir.
No, I'm not surprised. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you.
So, yeah, it was an interesting exchange. By the way, I want our viewers to know that we're going to send out in a follow-up email the link to the entire congressional hearing because it is worth listening to from beginning to end. This center has been extremely problematic. As you heard from the president, there are no plans to shut this center down, to monitor the speech that's coming out of the center. They have webinars that are routinely broadcast to their viewers. I guess, you know, in the question that I would ask you, Rebecca, we obviously tenured professors. There don't seem to be any consequences for speech that often veers into hate speech. For parents, alumni, New Jersey taxpayers, all of us in this state have a vested stake in this university becoming, you know, a healthy climate for all students, Jewish students, our students, and all students to be able to exist as college students, to be able to live their best lives as college students. What is the best way, do you think, that we can hold the president's feet to the fire to make our opinions known, to have some kind of influence, some kind of impact on turning things around at this university?
Yeah, that was a couple of questions in one. So let me just start by saying, I think that, you know, the answer really is the same for tenured and non-tenured faculty. There are, you know, disciplinary processes. There is due process that everyone is has available to them. But the AAUP has guidelines on professional ethics, which clearly state that, in the classroom, for example, professors should not be introducing material that is completely irrelevant to their own subject matter. And also, while not avoiding controversial material, in fact, let's have discussion about controversial material, it must stimulate debate and learning that is germane to the subject matter. And that's a quote from the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors. So, I think that department chairs and deans need to be trained that that's part of professional ethics and take a little bit of responsibility for what's going on in the classroom. The other thing is that university budgets, like all institutional budgets, reflect their values. And if the university is supporting this center or any other research center or position, which is a kind of special initiative, a special center that goes above and beyond the faculty member salary, but gives them a kind of platform to, promote their ideas, some of them extremely problematic, then the university is saying, this is what our values are. This reflects our values. And so that also, the university needs to take some ownership of that.
Yeah, and doesn't it go further than that, though? As one of the people, one of the viewers asking in the chat put it, calls for violence. I don't know that it has actually crossed that line, but should it cross that line, that is actually illegal according to the laws of our state.
So again, I'm not the person to ask about that, but I know that the university has interpreted that very, very broadly, that only when a call for violence is directed against a specific individual or set of individuals, like those Israeli students at AEPI, against whom there was a death threat, does it cross the line into illegality. And the rest of it is protected speech. So I'm not the lawyer, not the person to be consulting about that, but I think that's anyway the university's perspective. And I think that was, that's where a lot of universities have found themselves shackled. But there are still, again, steps that can be taken to limit the influence of faculty members who are promoting speech or actions or ideas that are not consistent with the university values. But the university has to have the institutional courage to say, this does not reflect our values, and therefore we're pulling funding for the research center. I don't expect, I don't know, maybe that will happen. I guess we can.
Well, not according to what the president said to the congressional hearing, but who knows the way that this is going to unfold in the coming academic year. Is there any difference between the obligations of a public university like Rutgers? This is another question in chat.
Yes.
Different obligations of a public university different from private universities, and if so, in what way?
So again, we should have a separate webinar with a First Amendment specialist, a lawyer who can really answer some of these questions. But my understanding is, yes, public universities are they have to revert to the First Amendment. They're not really allowed to introduce restrictions on speech beyond what the First Amendment allows, right? They have to kind of uphold the First Amendment. What they can regulate, again, are time, place, and manner of protest. But they can't say to someone, you're not allowed to say those words, unless the words, again, are a direct threat to another individual.
Yeah.
Again, that's just my understanding as a musicologist.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I'm putting questions to you
That's
that
okay.
You're right, should be put to a First Amendment attorney. But I am seeing a comment in the chat from a faculty member at Rutgers who wants to get more information about JFAS, and I'm sure you'll be happy to share that. We will take this professor's information and get that to you. I just wanted to let you know that. I do want to ask one more question from the audience before I get to my last two. I guess the question is about whether or not the university did, quote unquote, capitulate to the pro-Palestinian, or what some are calling pro-Hamas demands to dismantle that encampment.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there were certain things that you referred to in your letter about the Palestinian faculty that they plan to hire, that you're concerned about them turning into faculty or scholar activists about this new center for life for Arab or Palestinian students, and you say, you know, this will be funded by the university, whereas Hillel and Chabad are funded by the Jewish community. I mean, in what ways would you say what was it most egregious in respect to the university acceding to the demands of
Right.
the demonstrators?
Look, to me, part of the problem was simply in the process, that the university has procedures for determining what academic initiatives to prioritize, how to allocate funds, and those processes are based on principles of shared governance and adherence to university policy, the student code of conduct, standards of professional ethics. So negotiating with the encampment protesters elevates the demands of the radical few above those of a more reasonable majority. So just in terms of process, I think you're already seeing an upending of the university's kind of normal operations and modes of governance in order to get the encampment to go away basically in time for commencement. The other problem that I see is that there is a lot of vagueness in the promises that were made, how those things would be implemented, what they look like, and a lot of questions that should have been raised, could have been raised, if the university had turned to some of its Jewish campus organizations, including the Chancellor's Advisory Council on Antisemitism, which was convened by the Chancellor, right? They were ready and willing to engage in discussion, but they weren't consulted and they didn't have the opportunity to ask questions at the time. So there's a lot of vagueness that, to me, just sort of raises the specter of a lot of future problems. Just as one example, you know, they did not commit to the creation of a new Department of Middle East Studies, but they created to convening a working group to conduct a feasibility study for a creation of that department. And again, you know, how will the administration ensure that if the kind of implementation is being left to, you know, the academic leadership is being left to the Chancellor's Advisory Council on Arab and Palestinian and Muslim life, what space is there for Jewish or Israeli faculty in a Middle East Studies department, which seems like that would be a pretty important facet of that department. And so already you're kind of seeing the potential for real imbalances, even, you know, sort of doubling down on the imbalances that already exist in the way that the conflict in the Middle East is already being taught or not taught and addressed, or kind of, you know, well, just addressed or not addressed within the university. And there, you could sort of go down the list and look at the vagueness of the language. And a lot of that vagueness, I think, opens the door to problems. Now, I'm not in my questioning of the first provision about the creation of an Arab cultural center. I don't think that that's a problem at all. But what I'm saying is there's a serious, again, imbalance in the way that these cultural centers are sort of, they're implemented, there are a lot of these cultural centers around the university, but again, the Jews are the kind of odd ones out. And I think that that's partly because there is this misconception that Judaism is just a religion, when in fact it precedes these artificial distinctions between religion, race, and ethnicity, and other kind of, you know, categories, artificial categories that were created mostly in the 19th century. So, you know, Judaism doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. So it's yet another way in which the Jewish community is sort of marginalized and left out of the kind of standard, you know, university parlance and operations. So these are the concerns that I have. It's not like there was one thing that was the most egregious.
Sure. No, and it does seem, looking in from the outside, that the loudest voices are the ones that seem to get the job done. Meaning all of the work that you did behind the scenes, the ways that you have tried to collaborate, you know, in a collaborative way with the university, that sort of is drowned out by the loudest voices and by the threats of, you know, finals being canceled or graduation exercises having to be moved. And I think the ugliness of it all is sort of what is left with us. But it does sound like the administration is taking your good counsel and the recommendations that you have made, that they are having their feet held to the fire by the House Committee on Education and Workforce, and for that we're deeply grateful. I do want to ask you about your plans before we button this up. Your plans for this coming fall, because to our dismay, we are losing you as one of our most important voices at Rutgers, at least as a faculty member. So please tell us what your plans are for the 2024-2025 academic year and moving forward.
Sure. I was offered a really wonderful opportunity, really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, to be the Dean of Undergraduate Liberal Arts and Sciences at Yeshiva University, which is an institution that I care about very deeply. I have a master's degree from Yeshiva. It's, sort of an important community institution in the Orthodox Jewish world. And so the idea that I will be able to put my knowledge of higher education to service directly of the Jewish community, that was sort of too good to pass up. But again, Rutgers means a lot to me. I've invested a lot of time and effort and energy here, and I hope to find ways to continue to support Jewish faculty, students, and staff here.
I'm sure you will. I also have to ask you, you had almost a front row seat at Yeshiva University's commencement ceremony. It's probably, a normal thing for there to be Orthodox dancing at the end of the commencement exercises. But this time, Senator Fetterman, who was commencement speaker, was in the middle of that event, which must have been pretty incredible to watch.
It was unreal, very exciting.
Yeah, he even, as those of us who watched the commencement activity saw, he took off his Harvard academic hood because he himself has been so disturbed by what's been going on at his alma mater. Rebecca, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you being with us tonight and sharing your experience and your perspective. And I know that I speak for all of us when I say how deeply grateful I am for your leadership, your courage, and your quiet heroism. Yeshiva University is lucky to have you, and so are we as fellow members of the Jewish community of New Jersey. I want to wish you the best of luck as you start your important, big new position at YU. Hopefully there will be others like you filling your shoes, taking your place.
There are so many people who've stepped up.
I have no doubt there are. I certainly know of some students. I have no doubt there are faculty, but that they will continue to do what you have done, which is speak truth to power, to work to provide the best possible college experience for Jewish students on campus. Of course, the Jewish Federations of New Jersey, Northern New Jersey, South Jersey, Somerset, Hunterdon, and Warren counties, heart of New Jersey, and of course, the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West. We will all be standing with you shoulder to shoulder as you deal with these challenges ahead. To everyone on this webinar, I want to remind you that Tuesday is primary day in New Jersey. Those of you who are registered Democrats, please note that one of the voting options on the primary ballot is for uncommitted delegates whose slate is Justice for Palestine and permanent ceasefire now. We hope you consider that as you go into the voting booth, and that when you go to the polls on Tuesday, that you vote for candidates that are not the uncommitted candidates. An action alert will be going out on this tomorrow. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and good night.